Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you guys my Dreamcast collection and talk a bit about them. And I don't have too many Dreamcast games compared to some of the other consoles I've sort of gone over the years. But I feel like I have a pretty decent amount of the good Dreamcast games. I know there are a few of the expensive ones that I don't have. I don't feel that I need to buy them, for one reason or another. Maybe I have them on another console or something. So it won't be the most comprehensive collection of all time, but hopefully it'll give you some insight on the console in case you're curious about it, and let you know if some of the games or all the games are still worth playing today, 15 years later. Dreamcast is one of the most interesting consoles of all time, I'd say, one of the most peculiar ones. Of course, it's Sega's last console. Yeah, I guess without further ado, we will get to the games. This is Sega, so of course we have to start off with a Sonic game. And here we have Sonic Adventure, which launched with the Dreamcast in 1998 in Japan. It's funny because it actually came out here in the US a year later, 9/9/99. That was a big launch date back in the day. It was a pretty big deal. And people often talk about how great that 9/9/99 launch was, but give any console a year to sort of simmer and marinate, and of course it'll have some good games by then. I mean, even the Wii U or the PS4 or whatever, so it kind of doesn't count, but anyway. So Sonic Adventure is sort of the first truly 3D Sonic game. I mean, they had some sort of foray into 3D before. There was Sonic 3D Blast on the Genesis, but that was kind of like this weird isometric game. It barely even counted. There's supposed to be a 3D Sonic game on Saturn called Sonic Extreme, but they never finished it. So this was pretty much, Sonic's first 3D game. And it's definitely not Mario 64. I mean, Mario 64 is an all-time classic, one of the best games ever made. But I kind of like Sonic Adventure. The levels themselves are pretty fun to play. They feel pretty. They have that sense of speed, and there's just a rhythm to how you play. It's much better than the recent Sonic games. I know some people like Sonic Generations and Sonic Colors and all that, but I don't like them at all, to be quite honest. I think Sonic Adventure, while the levels are good, it is flawed in some ways. Like, the overworld is kind of messed up. It's not really intuitive as to where you're supposed to go all the time. You always have to consult this weird blue orb that sort of like tells you where to go, because you couldn't really figure it out on your own through the actual like design of the world. So it's kind of flawed in that way, but it was ambitious in its day. It has great music. It was released on the GameCube as Sonic Adventure DX and later ported to the 360 and PS3 and PC. But I do like the Dreamcast version just because of the graphics. I feel like in the DX version it feels too shiny, as if like all the characters are like made of lollipops or something. It looks a little bit better on the Dreamcast. It also just feels like a Dreamcast game, Sonic on a Dreamcast, on a Sega system. It just makes sense. I don't have Sonic Adventure 2, just because I feel like the GameCube one is actually better. And it's relatively expensive on the Dreamcast, like $25-30, so I don't really feel the need to double dip on that one. But I do like Sonic Adventure 2 a little bit better than Sonic Adventure. Not too much to add. One of the last good Sonic games. Pretty unfortunate what's happened to the series, but yeah, most series don't have a long shelf life anyway. So anyway, on that bleak note, move on to the next game. Next we have Soul Calibur by Namco. This was a huge deal when it came out. It caught a lot of people by surprise. I mean, the game had come out in arcades prior, but it was kind of underwhelming. People didn't really like it that much. When they ported it to Dreamcast, added a lot of new features. I don't know if they added new characters, but it was just more fleshed out in general. It let's see what to say about Soul Calibur. I mean, it's a very fast and smooth 3D fighting game, weapons based, which was pretty unique at the time. Some games had done weapons before, but not quite at the level of the Soul Calibur series. Um, it has an actual single player mode, which most fighters, especially from Capcom, have like an arcade mode, just kind of cheating in a way. Not really. It doesn't really give you much to do unless you're playing multiplayer. So that was much appreciated at the time. Um, it's hard to say whether you should play Soul Calibur 1 now. I mean, personally, my favorite is Soul Calibur 2 on the GameCube. I think that is a better game. It has, a better roster. It feels a little bit better to me. But Soul Calibur 1 in its day was incredible and one of the defining games on Dreamcast, and probably one of the best selling games on Dreamcast, too. So if you're sort of knee deep in the Dreamcast library, if you really want to sort of, get into what people were playing on the Dreamcast, back in 99, 2000, 2001. Soul Calibur is pretty much, one of the essentials. Alright, next up we have a unique one, Jet Grind Radio, which is the unfortunately titled North American name. It's actually called Jet Set Radio, which is actually what I'm going to call it from now on, because Jet Grind Radio is kind of stupid. I feel like I'm not really sure why they changed the name. It might have been for copyright reasons. It also might have been because they were sort of like riding on the coattails of Tony Hawk and grinding and to make it seem more appealing. But anyway, regardless of the name, it's a really unique game, as a lot of Dreamcast games were and still are. It's one of the first cel shaded games that I'm aware of, kind of like Wind Waker. This is kind of set in a city, or various cities rather, and you play as this dude on the box. I forget his name. I think his name is like Beat or something. Sorry, I can't remember it. It's like a word, like one word. You go around like spray painting certain areas and like running from the cops. It actually sounds like a pretty kind of a dark game, but it's kind of lighthearted, like pretty much all Dreamcast games are actually. It even has like a sort of warning screen in the beginning stating that you shouldn't copy this stuff in real life, so that's kind of funny. Controls not that great. They don't really hold up today. The game was re-released on let's see, PS3, Vita, 360, PC, maybe some others, but I think those are actually better from what I heard. I'm not entirely sure. I have it on Vita, which I got through PS Plus, but I never actually got around to playing it on that. But very unique game. When I think of the Dreamcast, this is definitely one of the games I think of, just because it sort of it highlights the creativity that Sega, their development teams had, despite the fact that they were hemorrhaging money at that point, and they were going through some tough times. So morale had to be low, but at the same time, they were very creative too. So it's kind of tragic in a way, but to be honest, through a lot of mishandlings, they sort of deserved what they got. So yeah. Next up, speaking of another kind of weird and creative game, Samba de Amigo. I can't believe they released this in the U.S. But basically it's a rhythm game starring this monkey, which I think his name is Amigo. It's a rhythm maraca based game, kind of like DDR, but you're using a maraca peripheral. Basically, you have these maracas and you have a mat that you place on the floor, and there are sensors on the mat, and you just shake to the beats and to the on-screen, you display or whatever, the prompts, and then yeah, it kind of works like DDR and a lot of other rhythm games, but it's pretty unique just because you're using maracas and it has this weird character and a lot of crazy stuff is going on in the background. It's pretty amusing. like I said, a very creative game, very niche game. It's kind of Sega's problem. They've always had trouble sort of making, franchises that resonated with a lot of people, except for Sonic. So they never had like the smash hits. They didn't have like a deep roster of franchises like Nintendo. They have Mario, Zelda, DK, Pokemon, all that stuff. Sega was always, you know, for better or for worse, they were always trying new things. Couldn't establish, a market, which is why they had to leave, unfortunately. But Samba de Amigo, I really do like. It was released on the Wii, but it is not as good because the Wii or the maracas were, I believe, third party, and they were kind of crappy. So this is one that I would pick up on Dreamcast. And the maracas are pretty pricey, like 50, $60, I think, but obviously you need them if you want to play this. But the game itself is like $5, and like 10 new. So yeah, definitely worth playing. Alright, next up we have Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. People on the internet are sort of hesitant to acknowledge like these sort of sports and extreme sports games. They usually cost like $1 on eBay and like bargain bin and stuff like that. They're just not very well loved on the internet, and they're not really talked about on message boards. But back when Tony Hawk or these games came out, they were on par with like the best of their era. I mean, these were state of the art games, and I never liked skateboarding in real life. I mean, but I've always loved the Tony Hawk series. Well, to be fair, maybe like the first four games, but I love the fact that the Tony Hawk games they had this feel to them. They felt sort of edgy, and it had this like sort of the soundtrack that was like punk rock and like the underground rap and all this. It just had a vibe going for it. It felt like you were like a rebel or something. I don't know. The sort of missions you had to do, like a lot of them involved like causing trouble and stuff like that. So it was kind of cool. The combo system I always thought was it's very unrealistic but very fun and sort of easy to pull off a lot of tricks. And they other skateboarding games like Skate are more realistic but less fun in my opinion. For someone who's not into skateboarding, like I mentioned earlier, so for the first Tony Hawk game, it hasn't aged that well, admittedly. It's pretty limited. There's not too much you can do. The levels are pretty small relative to the subsequent games. You can't do a manual like you could in 2 or a revert like you could in 3 to keep your combos going. So, like I said, a pretty limited game, but I kind of like the soundtrack. Well, not kind of. I do like the soundtrack, and it is sort of fun to play as a novelty, sort of remembering, what it was like to play the original game, back in '99 or whenever it came out. So, and it is best on Dreamcast in my opinion. Well, it might be best on PC, but I never played that port. But I have played every other iteration of Tony Hawk 1, and I'd say Dreamcast is the best. So that's why I have that on this list actually. So yeah, Tony Hawk 1. And next up we have a sequel, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. I actually consider this one of the best games of all time. I just think adding the manual added a lot to the game. The levels were a lot bigger. I like the soundtrack a lot. There was a lot to it. And I think it's a toss-up between this and the Xbox version, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X, as to which one I feel is the best. I feel like 2X, the physics were a little off. And this is very nitpicky, but I feel like the menus are a little boring and sterile or whatever. And that sounds like a really, really minor thing, but it just didn't really sort of jive with the rest of the game. It felt out of place. like I was saying, the Tony Hawk games have a vibe to them, and the menus were kind of, it was weird, and they feel more cohesive on the Dreamcast, on PS1 version and stuff like that. So I'd recommend the Dreamcast version. Uh, if you don't like skateboarding, you don't like sports games, this kind of transcends sports games. So yeah, definitely pick this up. And like I said, Tony Hawk games are extremely cheap, so there's no reason not to get this. All right, next up we have Marvel vs. Capcom. So it's funny, just putting my head back in, when this game came out. This is before like the Marvel craze, like before Marvel became cool all of a sudden. Like, it's crazy now to think about how, like, the average person knows who Iron Man is, or they know who, like, Rocket Raccoon is. It's insane because when Marvel vs. Capcom came out, like, no one knew who, like, half the Marvel roster was. They knew who, the X-Men were and Spider-Man, but, little else outside of, those few key franchises. But anyway, this is kind of a really unique crossover. As the title might, indicate, it's Marvel characters versus Capcom characters in a fighting game. And it has a pretty decent roster. It has, the ones you'd expect: Hulk, Spider-Man, Wolverine, and stuff like that. And on the Capcom side, it's Mega Man, Ryu, and Chun-Li, and stuff like that. So it has a lot of the essential characters. It's a 2-on-2 tag-based fighting game. Things are going really fast. It's pretty hard to keep up if you're not used to fighting games, but it's also very accessible. I remember playing this in the arcade when it was, still new, and anyone could pretty much play it. So it was a lot of fun to play. I love the vibe it has going for it. It's very upbeat. I love the art style too. I just love the sprite work in this game. Like, when I look at the new X-Men now, I always sort of wish they looked like the Marvel vs. Capcom iterations. But alright, sorry guys, had a little bit of technical difficulties, but should be fine now. But as to whether you should play the game now or not, it was released on XBLA and PSN relatively recently. So if you were to play this game, I'd play it on those. It was also released on PlayStation, but that version was pretty bad. It had load times, and it was missing important frames and stuff like that. The Dreamcast is the best physical version you can buy. So if you just want a physical version of the game, I would definitely get the Dreamcast version. The only thing to note is that the Dreamcast controller, is not very good for fighting games at all. For me personally, I actually have a Dreamcast to PS2 adapter, so I can use my PS2 controllers for fighting games because it's a lot better. And of course, you can use PS2 arcade sticks and stuff like that. There are some Dreamcast fighting sticks, but they're pretty expensive, and there aren't too many of them. So, yeah, I would keep the controller situation in mind for that. But yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom, a game I still like and still play to this day. And next up, we're going to talk about the sequel, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I find that the cover of having Psylocke and Guile as the prominent characters is pretty questionable. I feel like they were sort of doing the game a disservice by not having like Spider-Man or Ryu on it. But I applaud them for being bold. But anyway, this game pretty much took the original Marvel vs. Capcom and sort of upped the ante in every way. The roster has, I believe, 56 characters, which is insane. It's 3-on-3 instead of 2-on-2. The combos are, even crazier. The possibilities are pretty much endless. Uh, it has pretty much every Capcom and Marvel character you'd want. It has this awesome jazzy soundtrack with a memorable character select music. Um, it's a really fun game. Also released on the PS2 and Xbox, the original Xbox. I have it on PS2. It's all right, but the Dreamcast version is a little bit better. It has all the frames of animation and it has less load times or faster load times rather. Xbox version I haven't played myself, but I heard it's a little bit better than the PS2 version. But it's the original Xbox, so not a very you know great proposition there. So it was also re-released on PSN and 360 or XBLA rather, but unfortunately, I think they've been discontinued, so you can't really buy them there anymore. So I don't think they're viable options anymore. So that's unfortunate. So with that being said, the Dreamcast version is probably the best one to buy at this moment, anyway, barring any sort of re-release on PC or something. But do keep the controller situation in mind. Like I said, it's pretty much unplayable on a Dreamcast controller, these fighting games. So have a solution in mind. Get one of those PS2 converters or get a Dreamcast arcade stick or something if you want to play this game on a Dreamcast. So, but yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, one of my favorite fighting games, and still very playable to this day. Still learning new stuff about it. So, yeah. And here we have sort of a unique one. Space Channel 5 has a sort of, holographic lenticular cover, so it's kind of cool. So, this was made by, I forget his first name. It's killing me that I can't remember because he's actually one of my favorite developers, but Mizuguchi is his last name, and he used to work at Q Entertainment. I think he's left the company recently, but basically the company made games like Rez, which is also on the Dreamcast, but not going to talk about that here because I don't have it, and I also think it's better on the 360. Also made Luminous on the PSP, which is amazing, and Child of Eden. So pretty good pedigree. This is kind of like those games that it's a sort of musically, it has a musical theme to it. It's a little simpler than those games. You just sort of follow the directions like a DDR game, but you use the controller. It's very, like the cover might sort of hint at, a very unique game. You play as this pink-haired, reporter in space. Her name's Ooh La La. Michael Jackson's in it randomly. He's also in the sequel, which didn't come out on Dreamcast in the US, but did come out on PS2. And it's available on 360 and maybe PSN as well. Maybe PC. I don't really remember, but it's not as good as Mizuguchi's other games, but they're pretty. The game's pretty good. It's solid. It's not special, but it just has that Dreamcast feel, like positivity, and it's just you. I don't know. It's just one of the quintessential Dreamcast games, I guess. So, also a very dirt cheap game, as many Dreamcast games still are. I don't know for how much longer though. So, I'd get this while you still can for cheap. Alright, and next up we have Crazy Taxi. So, it's funny because this came out in 99 or something. I don't know exactly when in arcades, but it's one of those just, head slapping things where, like, why wasn't this made, 20 years prior? Like, the concept is simple but brilliant. Like, it just seems perfect for the arcades. You're a taxi driver, you pick up people, and you take them to their destination. Simple as that. It has some real life locales. It has KFC and maybe some other stuff. Maybe Pizza Hut. I don't really remember, but I know that's KFC at least. And it's a very over the top, yet again another lighthearted game. They Not too much to say here. Just like I said, it's a very simple game. Uh, they did sort of, I forgot what company, but they pretty much stole this idea and made Simpsons Road Rage on PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, which is the same game but with Simpsons characters. The series just didn't have too much life in it. I mean, they made Crazy Taxi 2, which is also on the Dreamcast, but the series had kind of died by that. It's like kind of a one, hit thing. You don't really need more than one Crazy Taxi. So for what it is, it's a really fun game, very replayable. So and you had to get another cheap Dreamcast game, so that always helps. All right, and here we have one of the more controversial Dreamcast games, Shenmue. It has a storied development history. It initially began development on Saturn. Um, there are videos floating around with Saturn footage. It looks great for a Saturn game, but pretty bad overall, all things considered. But it was a very ambitious game. One of the most ambitious games of all time, really. I mean, it's a sort of open world pre Grand Theft Auto 3 game. Uh, the first one takes place in Japan, 80s Japan, I believe. And it's very detailed. You can open up drawers and stuff is in them, and I feel like GTA is very very expansive, but there's not much to do. You can't enter a lot of buildings. There's it's focused on the macro rather than the micro. Shenmue, very micro oriented. You could buy soda from a vending machine. You could play games at an arcade. You can play with a cat in your house. There's a lot of mundane activities that at the same time was very boring for some people, but also very immersive for others. So, like I said, it's a very divisive game. It's arguably one of the things that put Sega out of business because of how expensive it was to produce. It was too ambitious for its own good, and at the time it was the most expensive game ever developed, so it did not help Sega's situation at all. They did make Shenmue 2 on the Dreamcast, but it did not release in the US. It did release in Japan and Europe, and it came on Xbox in the US eventually, but unfortunately, it has the horrible American voice acting from the first game, which is, like I said, terrible. Whereas the European Dreamcast version of Shenmue 2 has the Japanese voice acting with English subtitles. So if you're willing to pay like 60, $70, I would import the European version and find a way to play that onto US Dreamcast or whatever, region Dreamcast you have. Sorry, I shouldn't assume that people are just American. It's a bad habit. But yeah, Shenmue. I don't love the game, but I respect it for its ambition. One of the most unique games. It hasn't been re-released for some reason. I don't know why they wouldn't just port it somewhere, make back some of their money somehow. But people still ask for Shenmue 3. I think it's gonna happen. I think pretty much you know every game that people ask for is going to come out eventually, unless there's like some massive licensing issues. Like I never expected Mega Man 9 to come out when I was a kid, or Donkey Kong Country Returns, but they all ended up coming out. So fingers crossed if you're a Shenmue fan. And Banjo-Kazooie 3 is my white whale currently, in case you're curious for some reason. But yeah, Shenmue. All right, next up, probably the weirdest game of this list, Seaman. Kind of the awkwardly titled Seaman, I should say. It's kind of like a virtual pet game, I guess, if you were to label it with a genre title. It uses a microphone peripheral that only got used for this one game, and I don't know if it had a sequel. I think Seaman did have a sequel, but it was Japan only. that's one thing I haven't really looked into, but I think it did get a sequel, at least on Dreamcast or PS2 or something. But anyway, um, so it's not like other sort of pet simulators. You control this weird human fish hybrid character where it has the face of a dude but the body of a fish. I think it's on the back that can show you real quick. Yeah, here. So it's kind of a creepy character, and you can talk to him, and he talks to you, and he's very irreverent. He kind of backsasses you. You sort of you raise him from an egg to a seaman. It's narrated the game by Leonard Nimoy of all people, so that's kind of cool because it shows that despite Sega hemorrhaging money, they didn't spare any expense. If you were a Dreamcast owner, you didn't feel like you're getting slighted. You felt like Sega was actually trying to, make amends to its customers. So people on the Dreamcast were pretty happy at the time, which made its downfall that much sadder. But I wouldn't call Seaman a great game, to be honest. It's a novelty. It's worth playing for how weird it is, but it's also a pretty expensive game if you want it complete with the microphone and all that. I paid about like $40 for this, or like 35. So, yeah, I can't really say if it's worth it or not. I wish it were a little bit better, to be honest, but it's an interesting curiosity piece at least. Alright, next up we have NFL Blitz 2000. I kind of said this with Tony Hawk 1 and 2, but, sports games are looked down upon for the most part by the gaming community, at least on the internet, but I think Blitz has always transcended sports. It's a very over-the-top arcade sports game. It doesn't follow the rules, the weird, arbitrary football rules that are very hard for newcomers to get into. I'm a huge NFL fan, but even I admit that the sport has a lot of really complicated rules that people still don't understand to this day, a lot of people. Blitz is pretty simple. You have 4 downs. You try to get 30 yards for a new set of downs. There's no pass interference or anything. You can just hit people whenever you want. There are no penalties, really. Or actually, there aren't any at all. It's very fast-paced. There are late hits. It has a cool vibe to it, kind of like Tony Hawk, actually. It feels great. They keep it brisk. They're, I think, 1 or 2 minute quarters. I can't remember which. So the games end very quickly. Anyone can pick these up and play, or pick this game up and play. Sorry, guys, another slight issue, but anyway, yeah. Blitz is definitely worth getting, and in my opinion, it is best on Dreamcast. Aside from actually getting an arcade, which would be awesome, an arcade machine, rather. Better than the N64 and PlayStation versions, so yeah, definitely would get it on the Dreamcast if you were to get it at all, and it's dirt cheap like all sports games are, so yep, NFL Blitz 2000. Right, next up we have Toy Commander. This is kind of a creative game. You sort of play as these, toy vehicles in this sort of recreated American, household. You do sort of menial tasks. It kind of reminds you of Pilot Wings. You're sort of flying around in a helicopter, doing various tasks. And, I haven't gotten too far in this game. I just got it, actually. It's kind of an interesting game. Not that fun to play in terms of controls, but I appreciate it for its scale. I like the fact that it has, everyday house, utensils and stuff like that. It has different areas like a kitchen and, a kid's room and stuff like that. So that's kind of cool. I think it's a first-party Sega game. I don't know who specifically made it, but pretty interesting game, pretty cheap. I I guess it's worth trying out. It's not like an incredible game, but if you're digging deep into the Dreamcast library and you played sort of all the essentials, yeah, I'd give it a try. Right, next up we have Choo Choo Rocket. This is supposed to be primarily an online game. Dreamcast was one of the first games with, or first consoles with a built-in modem. I think it is the first actually. But yeah, it's kind of a simple game. Basically, you're this cat who tries to catch these mice, as the cover sort of shows here. It's like a top-down, sort of maze-like structure, a single screen, so very simple, throwback to the arcade days. They did re-release this on various platforms. It's on like iOS and iPad and stuff like that. I got it for free on iOS, and it's an okay game. It's not like groundbreaking or anything, but it's okay. Alright, and here we have Typing of the Dead. As the title might indicate to you, it is a House of the Dead game. I believe it's a recreation of House of the Dead 2, actually, but instead of using a light gun peripheral, you use a keyboard, which is very odd at the time. You sort of type out words to defeat the zombies as you would, shoot them with a gun otherwise in a House of the Dead game. But here they sort of play around with, the keyboard mechanic by having you type out these really weird words, and it's pretty funny. It's a pretty comical game. Game is very cheap. The keyboard might run you, 15, 20. The game itself I got new for like $5, so definitely worth it for the novelty. If you're trying to work on your typing skills, it's probably the best typing tool you can get. I mean, other typing software is pretty boring, so yeah, Typing the Dead, pretty cool game. Alright, next up we have Bangai-O. I can't remember who made this game. I want to say Treasure, but I should have looked it up. Sorry, guys, but I didn't. I know Treasure made the DS game, Bangai-O Spirits, or at least I hope they did. Sorry if they didn't. But it's kind of it's a unique sort of 2D shooter. It's not like the typical like vertical or horizontal shooter. It's pretty unique. Sorry, it's actually been a really long time since I played Bangai-O. Probably about like 10 years or so I can't say too much about it. I do remember liking it. It did come out in the N64 originally, alongside the arcade, and it was ported to the Dreamcast. I could be wrong about the order of these things, but sorry, you can tell I don't really know much about Bangai-O. That's why I'm sort of spewing out random information that I happen to know about the game. But I do remember it being pretty good, so yeah, I guess I would recommend it. Question mark. So yeah. All right, here we have Rayman 2. To be honest, I've never liked the Rayman character. Thought it was kind of dumb. The platformers are pretty overrated. Just couldn't get into the character. Never really liked Ubisoft outside of like the Splinter Cell games. And then Prince of Persia: Sands of Time was pretty cool too, but not my kind of game. I prefer like the Nintendo platformers personally and stuff like that. So don't want to waste your time by commenting too much on this. I haven't played too much of it, admittedly, but obviously, as you might guess, it's not one of my favorites. Alright, so here's Phantasy Star Online. It's kind of a pseudo MMO. It doesn't have quite the scale of a real MMO, but it does have a persistent world. Uh, it was one of the early online games on console. People really loved it back in the day. It's kind of a loot-driven game. Uh, I don't think it's worth really playing on Dreamcast today. The best version is on GameCube, Phantasy Star Online 1 and 2 Plus. Even though it's pretty expensive, it's the best way to play it. Obviously, the online servers aren't officially up for any of these games, though there are sort of third-party servers that are still up that you can play. Um, Not too much to add there, but it was a cool game in its day. Uh, Sort of set the stage for some of the recent console MMOs, actually. Um, so, so yeah, not something I get on Dreamcast, but it was definitely special back when it came out. All right, and I have some other games. I have NFL 2K1. I have a lot of the sports games like virtual tennis and MLB 2K and all that. Actually, I don't think it's called MLB 2K, but anyway, I just don't think they're worth talking about in 2014. They kind of passed their expiration date, so yeah, that about does it for the Dreamcast. Guess I'll just bring the console back. It's definitely one of the most unique consoles of all time. I love the look of Dreamcast games. They're very colorful. The games are usually 60 frames per second. They're just very upbeat. Like I said, it has like this pre 9/11 optimism to the system. I mean, and I don't know. I was sad to see Sega get sort of squeezed out by these multimedia corporations like Sony and all that, but it I guess it had to happen eventually. Sega had a lot of management issues, and to be honest, the Dreamcast, while it was innovative in some ways, like in online play, it was limited. The controller was pretty bad, and in order for it to compete with the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, it would have needed like a new controller that had two analog sticks. So that was another problem that it had. Um, it had limited disk space, so and it was also underpowered compared to the three that I named. So it had issues, but it's just it has its own unique place in console history, and the library is pretty cheap to get into, at least for now. I think it's probably going to pick up steam as it sort of becomes more of like this cult console. It'll be harder to find, games for cheap. So I would get on the Dreamcast train now, actually, if I were you. So yeah, thanks for watching the video. If there are any Dreamcast games you feel like I should play, would be happy to listen to any suggestions. So yeah, talk to you guys later.